Hi, I'm Phil Craig.
And I'm Andrew Loney.
And together we aim to bring you the most scandalous stories and some of the most scandalous people in history. So thanks for joining us here on the Scandal Mongers podcast. Hello and welcome to week 3 of my solo Scandal Mongers summer. And thanks a lot for everybody who tuned in to the last show. It did really well. Lots of great comments. And actually, it's my turn for the second month running to award Comment of the Month. So that's normally Andrew did it because he liked to pick people who said nice things about him. But it's me this week. So yeah, Frankie Steele 7868 commenting on our Boris Johnson program from some time ago. What a load of, I shouldn't say that word. Anyway, Frankie's not getting the Comment of the Month mug. Elaine Patterson 5310 made me smile. I'm a new subscriber, she says, and I found you through Shauna from Vintage Read. A lot of people have. In fact, and I was talking to Shauna for one of her programs only yesterday. So we're still great pod pals. So Elaine is working her way through our videos, and she says she spent a fortune buying Andrew's books. That's nice. And a few others you've mentioned. It's refreshing to find a channel where differences of opinion can be expressed without rancor or ridicule, which I think is really lovely because that's really what we're trying to do. She's looking forward to seeing the channel grow, and so am I. But actually, I'm sorry, Elaine, if I got your hopes up. I'm going to give the mug this week to Nick Greetham. Nick Greetham 4810, who's commented a lot over the months, now nearly, is it nearly 18 months of this podcast? Nick's commented loads of times. But he did comment on the last program with Gerald Posner. Just a very short comment that literally made me spit my coffee with laughter. So thanks for that, Nick. Nick just said, enjoyable chat with Benjamin Button. It's funny because it's true. Yeah, Gerald's 70. And if you haven't checked him out on any of our previous shows, you should, because he looks about 30. And he thinks Benjamin Button is funny as well. So yeah, you're going to get a mug for that and your other nice and funny comments about the back catalogue, Nick. Please send me an email. You can find out how on the bio, and I'll get you your much coveted Scandalmonger mug in the mail. I want to talk about Meghan a little bit. Actually, I should say today, I'm sure you already know from the bio, the bulk of this program is going to be about the Crusades. We haven't done the medieval era before. I think we did the Roman Empire. People seem to quite like that. So we're going to talk about the era of the Crusades with Steve, who's written this wonderful book, a very funny and amusing book, and full of facts and information that I didn't know. So stick around for that. But I'm going to talk a bit about Meghan because she's been in the news again, and it's a subject that we've talked about, the whole rift in the royal family. Talked about it many times, and it's not a secret that I've generally been a bit more sympathetic to the Meghan and Harry side than Andrew, and I think also most of our listeners, most of the audience. I get a lot of comments saying, "Oh, Phil, they've done this, they've done that," and I do agree with a lot about it. We've had a lot of very critical things said about Meghan and Harry by our various guests and ourselves, which is something which I agree with. But I thought it was quite poignant what she said, excuse me, this week on CBS. She's interviewed as part of a charity that tries to support kids' mental health, kids who are exposed to the nasty side of social media. And she said, talking about her own struggles, that she'd still not, quote, scraped the surface of my experience of what it was like being in the royal family. And she has previously spoken about how she was in such a bad way. She had thoughts of harming herself, which of course is awful. And I thought she came across rather well and very sympathetically in that interview, I have to be honest. Now, of course, people rushed to make the very obvious point that, hang on a minute, you've said some pretty horrible things, or you've allowed horrible things to be said on your account. It's pretty horrible to say that your sister-in-law, the future Queen of England, is a racist, because that's effectively what that team Montecito has said. And they've never kind of gone on the record to say, oh, no, we don't really mean that. Actually, Harry sort of has, but that's been left out there. And of course, they've also been connected to people who've said some really nasty things on social media, like Christopher Boozy, who's their friend, who's got well and truly stuck in. So, nobody's perfect. This is a very nasty, bitter rivalry at the heart of Britain's royal family. But I did feel a little bit of sympathy for Meghan in that interview. And it made me think a bit about my Diana book and what I've talked about before, about how I think that so much of this does go back to that era. And that, in fact, a lot of it is really more about Harry than her, that she got drawn into something that was already starting to happen. I talked to Shauna about this in my latest conversation with her, because she's a bit of a fan of my Diana book. And that book, I think, is what it's really trying to do is to decode, because we had some amazing access to people, not just who were telling the stories, but who were behind the stories now, working out how those stories came to be told. Stories of Diana, the really famous ones in the book with Morton, then Charles's account through Dimbleby, and then, of course, her interview with Martin Bashir. And how all of those things actually were two sides of a very kind of bitter divorce. And all of us know people who've gone through breakups and divorces, and we've all noticed how they exaggerate. We've all said, do you know, they were talking about that holiday and how miserable they were, but we were with them and they were fine. And that is what happens when people break up. Things from the past get argued over and twisted. The Diana story is full of things like that. But I think also the Harry and Meghan and William and Kate one is too. You know, he brought, and it's clear from his continuing legal struggles, he brought a lot of baggage into his relationship with Meghan. You know, long before they met, he was unhappy at the press, still is, but particularly unhappy at how the palace and the press interacted with each other. And this was particularly prevalent in the years before and just after his mother's death. One of our very early shows, we talk about this with Patrick Jeffson, Diana's former private secretary. The trashing of Diana with the active help of people who work for Harry's father. That really happened. And it was part of the operation to clear the way for Camilla to become accepted. I'm happy she is accepted now, to be honest, but I think that was a dark time, and I think Harry felt it very keenly. And he felt that there were deals done between the press and the palace, because there were, and other members of the family, not only his mother, he thinks himself, were damaged in the process. Now, I think, I say there's some truth in all of that. And I think then something else happened, a kind of normal jealousy between two brothers, especially as Harry saw William becoming more and more establishment as he got older, as he came to realize he was going to become the king. Well, he always knew that, but he got more and more goody two-shoes and less like the rebel, the fun rebel that was the brother that I think Harry liked to have. Inevitably, this was going to happen. He becomes part of the in-house royal establishment, and Harry's the spare. And he's disenchanted, and he feels it's not fair. Lots of things aren't fair. And I think when that happens, people can start to, like in a divorce, look into the past and start to twist things. I think by the time he meets Meghan, who was different, she's a breath of fresh air. Initially, everybody loves her. She comes into the family, but she's a little bit difficult. Maybe she's demanding. Maybe she's diva-like. You know, the officials let their feelings be known. We've talked about this. Valentine Lowe's book is very persuasive. I think she was a very hard boss. And people start rolling their eyes and saying, oh, you know, she's a bit this, she's a bit that. And that works inevitably into the press. People in the palace talk, and these stories start appearing in the press. And they'll say, well, here we are again. From Harry's perspective, the press are attacking. They've already attacked my mother. Now they're attacking my wife. Why won't the palace do more to help? Why won't they speak out? Well, there wasn't a great deal the palace could do. But, you know, he thinks it's favoritism. He thinks, here we go again. And he thinks some of the people who he thinks are the worst people in the world, tabloid hacks, are getting favors and are not being challenged. And it just gets worse and worse and worse. And maybe at some level, he begins to think that William and Kate agree with some of the criticism. Certainly when the courtiers complain, you know, maybe they take the courtier's side and they think that Meghan does need to change her behavior. Can you imagine all of that happening? It just feels very human, very real. And so paranoia sets in on all sides. And that's when things from the past really start to get twisted. And I'm sure that is where the racism allegation comes from. Some conversation, probably very innocent, probably meant to be had, to be taken in a good spirit. It's fun between friends. Oh, I wonder what the kids look like. What your kids look like. She's gorgeous. You know, let's hope they look like her, not like you. And so maybe then when Harry and Meghan are talking one night, he remembers this and they're both cross and they've had some row. And they said, "Do you know what they said? This is what they meant. Oh my God, the whole thing is so wrong." And it just feeds into their sense of persecution. And all of this gets more and more entrenched. Sleep's lost, mental health suffers. I've no doubt that it did on all sides. That interview that Meghan gave with Tom Bradby all those years ago in Africa, which was the first time many of us realized how deep the problem was. She was talking then, as she was at CBS last week, about her struggles, that she found it very difficult to cope, and that nobody really helped her except for Harry, who helps her but gets defensive and gets angry and confronts his brother, and then William gets angry, and then Megxit happens. And now suddenly it's an international phenomenon, and everything gets even more ramped up, just as with Diana and Charles, because there's money to be made by taking sides. There's book deals, there's documentaries. And I've said before, I thought the Netflix series was awful, just a slanderous, so much exaggerated nonsense about Britain and about all the things that a TV producer thought could be said about Britain. I think maybe more than Harry and Meghan thought. But it just made people even crosser, and it did seem very nasty. And maybe that means that they'll break with William and Kate forever. Some people think, some of the journalists we've interviewed recently have said that they don't think William will ever forgive him. I'm not so sure of that. Reconciliation is always possible, but it certainly would be advisable, because there's a lot of damage being done. Harry, is going on with his legal case. He looks increasingly obsessed with that. And it's very interesting. Meghan also said recently that she'd like him to move on. She didn't say it directly, but people who are close to her told People magazine, one of the better sourced places, I think, to get royal news. American readers and listeners may disagree, that she thought if he could back off more and, quotes, live in the moment, he'd be happier. I think that was true as well. As much as I support some of the things he's doing, trying to get Murdoch into court, he would be happier. But I guess my main point here is this is a sad and sadly familiar family drama that's being played out on a huge stage. And I think we should be more sympathetic to everybody involved, and that includes Harry and Meghan. And I think, I would love to see reconciliation, not just for them, but I think also, and this is really important, I think for Diana's memory, their own contentment, and for the way that she's remembered, and to put all of that poison behind them, if they ever could. That'd be lovely to see. Anyway, let me know what you think. That was my view. That was my thoughts. Andrew will be back soon. He can tell me I'm wrong. He probably will. Thinks I'm soft in the head a little bit and maybe I was over-impressed with Diana. Perhaps I'm over-impressed with Meghan, but I do think she had potential, and that it's just really, really sad what's happened. So that's my thoughts. And now, who wants to go and learn about the Crusades? I do. So I wasn't going to put, I don't know, I've got upstairs in the cupboard a big crowd. I was going to put it on. Maybe that would be a bit facetious. Anyway, let's hope you enjoy the conversation with Steve. And if you like the program, please keep watching, please keep liking and subscribing. We've had, we're still getting thousands and thousands a week, even though I'm only doing one every fortnight. But soon in September, we'll be back as a double act doing one a week. So thanks for all of you who stuck with us, and please enjoy the Crusades. Bye. Steve, so nice to meet you, electronically at least.
Yeah, lovely to see you, Phil. Really.
Now, I think I don't want you to think I'm treating your great work with any irreverence, but I think it's really important at the beginning of this conversation we establish what our medieval names are. So I've done a create new names for your Crusader night. You could be Frederick the Insignificant, Theobald the Miserly, Hoppo the Lion. I quite like Fulmar the Agile. Oh, Simon the Unbreakable. That's mine. I think I'll have that one.
Good man, good man. I have to say, my name is Theobald.
Oh.
But, literally, the name Tibble, which sounds like a Hobbit name or a Beatrix Potter name, actually is a derivation of Theobald. So I'll have to grab Theobald by the gauntlet there.
You certainly should. I really loved the book, and I use the word irreverent. I mean, it's a fun read. It's exciting. You really bring these people to life. It's a world that most of us know very little about, except for the odd movie we may have seen. What made you want to write this book?
Yeah, thank you. Talking of irreverent, I do try to make it slightly irreverent because I think we have a fairly stuck-up view of the past. It's kind of, particularly the Crusades. There's a lot of imagery around Victorians and chivalry and all of the gallantry kind of stuff, which is so far from the truth. So in a way, that really answers your question. I mean, that's why I wanted to write it, because I think the Crusades are a dystopian version of the Wild West, except with lots of cavalry with lances rather than six shooters. So I was very keen to bring that kind of fun but ghastly sort of scenario to,
No, it
to more
is
people's
those
attention.
two words are both very appropriate. It's fun, it's ghastly, it's just full of stuff that I never knew, and that's one of the pleasures of nonfiction, just finding out so much about a world you don't understand. When you start in your introduction, you write about how we all, as historians, try not to judge people by our own standards, and yet it is such a different world. I mean, it's such a different world, and the kind of enthusiastic, unapologetic love of fighting and of war seems to define so many of the people you write about.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're so different in so many ways. In some ways, they're better than us. Certainly, we've got an obsession with racism, quite rightly in many ways. There's very little racism in the Crusades. Ironically, people always count. You would assume this was a very intolerant set of societies on the Muslim side and on the Christian. In reality, certainly from an ethnic, racial point of view, people generally couldn't care less. It was much more about who your family was, who your tribe were, what your spiritual beliefs were. Very little racism. So yeah, these are, and I think that is the fun part of history as well. Is if you can put your kind of your judgment to one side and try and see them as they saw themselves and as facing the problems that they had. They get up every morning, they've got nothing. I get up in the morning, I open my laptop, I think I've done a good day's work. But for them, they haven't got clean water, they haven't got necessarily food for their kids. These are very low productive societies, and yet the guys go out there and do crazy things the whole time, which is why I'm always jealous of them. I wouldn't want to go on holiday with them, but I'm always jealous of the kind of things they can get up to, because I know I'm very unresourceful and a bit rubbish at things. So yeah, I'm in awe, really.
I mean, I guess we should, for people who don't know anything about the subject, we should say we're talking really about the 11th, 12th, 13th century, the Crusades that went out from Europe to the Holy Land. You say something, though, quite interesting about that, right? Again, in the beginning of the book, you say that often the problem that created these kind of acts of criminality that you focus on, it wasn't really religion at all. It was just the fact there were so many young men about trying to make their way in the world, in a world that was very unregulated and ungoverned and unstructured, in which they hadn't got much to start with. And the word testosterone appears an awful lot in your text, I noticed.
Yeah, it does. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's the yeah. I saw the film Casablanca during the writing of the book. So during lockdown, actually, when I first started writing it, and there's a line in it which to me sums up the whole of the Crusades. It's a kind of jokey line, but it's profoundly true. And there's a bit at the end where Captain Louis Renault says, "Round up the usual suspects." And that actually is a one-line explanation of the Crusades. There is a torrent of the usual suspects. You get, you're in a tiny piece of land, and for 200 years, it becomes a vortex, and it sucks in the usual suspects from as far afield as, say, Ireland or the middle of Africa or the Chinese borders. I mean, it is an absolute magnet for the usual suspects. So who are these suspects? Well, it's the same then as now, really. It's young men. It's people who are disenfranchised from their society. In this case, it's people who are underemployed, possibly impoverished, certainly got weapons training, and testosterone aplenty. So you've got this kind of appalling situation, really, and that's what made it the kind of the Wild West. And it's true whichever way you look at it, whether it's on sea, you have pirates. If you're in the middle of the desert, you have Bedouin bandits. If you're in the city, you have pub fights, murderers. If you're in the mountains, you've got assassins. It's an absolute criminality fest for 200
and I had
years.
never realized how much of it there was. That kind of for 200 years, this is what Europe did, and the Middle East and the Near East did. Not just the odd crusade, a king, Richard the Lionheart going off with an army. It's just continual. I think there's never really a year where there isn't crusading going on for 200, 250 years of some kind.
Yeah.
And even when there's
absolutely.
no formal invasions, the people that have settled in the Holy Land, because they do establish these Crusader states, they're fighting amongst themselves when they can't fight the Muslims.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You can't keep them away from a good fight. I mean, I think the key thing to remember is that we talk about the Crusades from a very Eurocentric perspective. Like, it's all about us, and either we're very proud of it or we're very embarrassed by it. In reality, we were just one of, we were kind of a bit part player. So, the whole thing was sparked off by invasions from, well, firstly Muslim invasions in the 7th century, and then Muslim invasions in the 11th century, because the Middle East obviously had been Christian before that time. But that's primarily, I don't think, really about religion. So the Crusades were a kind of a counter to those, particularly the 11th century Muslim invasions. But a lot of it was just the reflex action of sedentary societies trying to fight off nomads. The guys who were invading in the 11th century were Turkic tribesmen, they were nomads. They weren't theologians, they were heavy drinking, they liked drugs, they liked they liked astrology. These were not your real devout Sunni Muslims. These were guys who just picked up different things on the way. So everybody had to defend themselves. And that's, again, being Eurocentric, we see the Crusaders going out to defend the Christian communities as being the key thing. But in reality, all the local Muslim sedentary societies fought as well as they could as well. And they got a good kicking by the Turks, the same as the Christian communities did. And it's because you're in this kind of vortex where it's basically, if you think of it as a pub fight, everybody just piles in. It's like a Wild West saloon. Something starts it off. The trigger is climate change. Climate change forces these Turkic tribes who are nomads into the area. And, it all kicks off and everybody piles in. The Europeans we call Crusaders. The Fatimid Egyptians, were defending their own empire. The Byzantines were defending their own people. The Syrian Arab states were defending themselves against the Turks as well. And then you just had this kind of huge pub brawl that morphs on an enormous level. And the shocking thing is it just goes on for 200 years. Like now we're in the middle of the Ukraine war. Hopefully it'll finish soon, but we know it will finish. It'll be whatever it'll be, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, but it'll be finite. Crusades never finished. I mean, there was never peace. It was the occasional truce. And as you say, when the guys weren't busy fighting supposedly the enemy, they turned in on themselves. And that's true of the Crusaders or the Muslims or the Egyptians or whoever. It was just one big fight.
Well, you recount all sorts of incredibly colourful and gory stories of crimes and violence in your book. We call the scandal mongers on this podcast. Did the stories of the sort of stories you tell in your book, did they make their way back to Europe? And were people shocked, offended? Were there in fact scandals, or was it just, hey, they're just over there doing what they're doing? Thank God they're not doing it here.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, obviously it depends how you define scandal, but this whole process of big stories going back home definitely happened. And that happened all over. The thing that always
how did news spread in that? I mean, was it the church? Was it a primitive form of journalism? I mean, how did people come to know things about what was happening?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, well, the quick answer is slowly. So news didn't travel fast. A boat. So somebody in the Middle East, say a Templar, might write. They'll say, for instance, taking the Templars as an example, they might write a newsletter. They used to write newsletters, so they did have a kind of an informal kind of media. They had their equivalent of Fleet Street in Jerusalem, and they used to send back these newsletters, but it would take months to get back, and then those newsletters would be laboriously copied, and they'd be sent to other places, and so on. I mean, just to give you a sense of the rapid response force, the Crusader states were almost wiped out by Saladin when a battle took place in 1187, Battle of Hattin. Huge disaster. Half of the Crusader states are lost instantly, and they immediately send out word. But because it takes so long for word to get back and for people to muster their forces, it's something like 3.5 years that the rapid reaction force from Europe arrives. And that's the big problem of the Crusades. They are the Crusader states, all the local lads who are trying to defend the Christian communities out there are way on the edge of Europe. And they're, effectively on the fringe of this huge Islamic empire. So they're kind of a bit lost in space, really.
I think at the very beginning, though, when Pope Urban II first calls for a crusade, 1095, within a year, I think I'm quoting your book, 75,000 people have already gone. So that
Yeah,
must have gone through the churches, through sermons. And
yeah,
Europe sort of great. There's a scrap. Not only can we go and maybe make some money, we can get blessed by the church. I think you point out a lot of them were criminals or were in trouble with the authorities. And it was a way of kind of getting out of trouble, got to go to prison, and maybe also getting the blessing of the priest.
yeah. I think it's hard to. Yeah, you're right. The first crusade. I mean, huge enthusiasm. And the thing that always amazes me is how it carried on for 200 years. How there carried on being enthusiasm for crusading, because ultimately it's an unwinnable war. How do you keep a small strip of land on the edge of an Islamic empire that goes from North Africa up to Afghanistan and the borders with China? I mean, they are just a pimple on the back of Islam, and yet people, because they're genuinely pious. I don't think the money angle, anyone really believes that anymore. It's like if you wanted to bankrupt yourself, going on crusade was pretty much the surefire way to do that. So yeah, I think I'm always impressed by the levels of piety, and to an extent that I don't think we can understand that now. Even if you go to mass on a Sunday, it's not the same.
No, that's the thing about
yeah,
standards of today, isn't it? We are dealing with the people who genuinely believed in the afterlife in a way that most people,
yeah,
certainly in the Christian West, just don't, even if they still go to church. The
yeah,
absolute faith that there is a supernatural realm.
yeah, and that's true on all
separate them
sides.
from
Yeah,
us.
yeah. But actually, I mean, the wonderful thing about the Crusades, I think, is the extent to which there's huge amounts of scandal going on. I mean, it's actually built on scandal out there, but because they live in such a world of different values, people don't even register it. I mean, you get the stories. For instance, there's a Syrian prince called Usama, he's a real character, not a nice character. You wouldn't want to go on a trip with him. He's a really horrible person. But he tells two stories about scandal in his own family that to him are so great that he's really proud to tell them, and things that are clearly very, very wrong on every level and scandalous, he thinks are fabulous. So the first story he tells, is how he was 10 years old and he came across two of the servants fighting. So two unarmed men in his father's household fighting, having a bit of a scrap about almost nothing, who put a loaf of bread down somewhere. And he piles in and pulls out his dagger, which says something anyway for a 10-year-old, and guts one of these two unarmed men and kills him on the spot. And he's so pleased about this that he writes it down in his autobiography as a kind of look at me, I'm a great guy. Even age 10, I was able to murder unarmed people when they didn't expect it. And we know later in life he was exiled from his home in Shazar by his uncle, who was the kind of guy in charge, and he never says why. But to me, as a reader, it's so obvious. The guy's a psycho, and his uncle wanted him out of the way because he didn't want his own sons getting killed. And bizarrely, you can see where this kind of psycho mentality is coming from, because there was another scandal with Usama's father, who was another kind of princeling, and one day he was getting ready to go out on a skirmish, and his groom was going to bring his armor. The groom was a guy called Jammy, but he didn't have a very jammy life, because Usama's father, in incredible petulance, when the guy was a bit late coming with the armor, pulled out his sword and still partly in the sheath, and cut his arm off. Now, Usama writes about this as though it's a really good story. So we'd think of it as scandalous. This is the epitome of petulance and entitlement and what have you. But to Usama, it was great because his dad gave a bit of a pension to the bloke who was now unemployable and to his family. And probably died very soon thereafter. But his father was a really, really great guy because he carried on giving them a little bit of money. So their tolerance of scandal, what we would call scandal, was so high that it's endemic, but it doesn't often get characterized as scandal.
A lot of what you write about is what we call crime, would have been called crime then, both physical crime and pillaging, theft, rape, but also what you call white collar crime, embezzling funds, running off with the money, the treasure chest. But what did law and order mean, though, to those people? I mean, there weren't courts, or perhaps there were courts. There weren't prisons. Perhaps there were prisons. But what could be done if somebody was caught randomly chopping the arm off a servant or running off with a bag of gold? What was the sort of infrastructure of punishment?
Yeah, no, a good point. I mean, I think you hit it on the head there, really. I mean, there are two kinds of criminals. So the ones who always get away with it because they're entitled. So Usama got away with murdering his unarmed servant. His dad got away with it because, you know, they're both entitled. And actually they were so comfortable doing these crimes that they could boast about them. But for more normal people, it was a very difficult thing. It was a very kind of binary situation. If you think nowadays we've got a prison system, we've got therapy, we've got, remand centers, blah, blah, we've got courts, we've got a police force, and we are in, relative terms, a very productive society. And that a lot of that productive economy goes into supporting those kind of systems. If you think in the Crusades, pretty much everybody is rubbish. They've all got really crap economies producing very little excess. Egypt is a bit of an exception because they've got the Nile, so they're very they're much more productive, and they do have a bit more of a cash economy, and they do have a rudimentary prison system. But beyond that, everybody is faced with the difficult question that you raised, which is how do we catch and punish people who do crime and deter people from doing it again? And what you find is you end up with a very binary approach, because you haven't got many prisons. You've got the odd dungeon, but that's more for holding, high value prisoners for ransom. So you have to do a very visible punishment to discourage everybody else from doing it, or you have to let people off, give them a rap on the knuckles and then say, leave the village and don't come back. In terms of visibility, you see there's some really weird stuff that carries on in the Crusades long after it's died out in Europe, and that particularly trial by combat, which is very, very Hollywood. We think of trial by combat in medieval times, and actually it was not common in Europe. In fact, in Europe, Western Europe, by the time of the Crusades, it was almost defunct because it was seen to be quite barbaric. But in the Crusades, as you said right at the beginning, everybody's fighting. All the lads like a bit of a punch up, and they're poor, so they haven't got a big legal system. So what they do is they put two guys in a ring, and they can punch it out and beat each other to death, and the will of God will be expressed through whoever wins that fight. Bizarrely, you do get the situation where occasionally, that sounds like an appalling system of justice. It sounds like a parody of justice to us. But if you all believe in it, it sometimes delivers really great results. There's one instance in Cyprus which is a kind of Crusader state off the coast. It was kind of like the aircraft carrier of the Crusades, where there was a very unhappy marriage, and the wife of the knight was murdered, and the knight wasn't around, so he couldn't have done it. But the mother, his mother-in-law, and the mother of the woman who died, thought he was guilty and wouldn't take no for an answer. And because she had been widowed, the king had to take on her cause. So the king of Cyprus convened a trial, got his champion to fight this knight, the widowed knight. And they both fought it out. And it was real Hollywood stuff. They're both on horses, they got lances. It's a classic joust, but with sharp tips to the lances. And the king's champion gets wounded in the shoulder. Not great, but he inflicts a lot of damage on the widower. So at the end of it, it's judged that the knight is guilty. So you think, bloody hell, what a parody of justice. This poor guy, he clearly wasn't around. He wasn't on the scene, so he couldn't have done it physically himself. And he's now been wounded, and he's going to be executed for this murder. Strangely, it all worked out incredibly well. As he was just being taken off to the gallows, the knight said, yeah, it's a fair cop. And now that God has seen into my soul, I can tell you, I paid someone to do it so that I could swear on the Bible that I wasn't there, because I wasn't there. And as he was hung, he in a funny sort of way, he'd had release because he'd confessed and he truly believed in his immortal soul and purgatory and so on. And justice really was done for society as well, at relatively minor cost, just the cost of two guys who were going to be hanging around anyway.
Lord.
Yeah.
We mentioned men fighting men, and we mentioned testosterone a lot. Were there any women at all in the crusade? Did they travel to fight or just to be with their husbands or partners? Or in your sources, did you come across any women telling stories?
Women were far too sensible to, by and large, go on crusade, and the ones that did nearly always went back. So clearly there were women on Crusader armies, and I suspect they took a lot of casualties on the way round. They were, a lot of these early crusades in particular were walking all over Europe and through the Middle East, fighting along the way. They were the huge attrition, and I suspect women and children who weren't encouraged to go, but if they did want to go, they suffered a lot. It's sort of like the Vikings. Vikings, when they go a Viking, they don't take their family with them. Same with the Turks, actually. And that's again one of the issues. That's why you get the usual suspects in such a distorted way, because it is young men who've left their families behind. And the whole thing about the Crusades clearly is, round up the usual suspects. The rounding up, they do it themselves. The police don't need to round them up. There's this kind of magic formula that just drags everybody into this huge pub fight. But you find a lot of the guys, they instantly get married, or whatever form of marriage, as soon as they arrive, much in the same way as Vikings did. So as soon as we think of the Crusaders as being, literally white knights and riding around on big horses, in reality, most of the guys were ethnically mixed, so mixed race. All the Crusader states were mainly mixed race people called Pulani. Even the kings were part Arab, part Armenian. So, and I think most Crusader armies in the East were primarily Arabs or Armenians as well, because we tend to forget that obviously the population of the Middle East were Christian until the Muslim invasions, and by the 12th century and 13th century, most of the population of the Holy Land was still Christian. So it wasn't hyperbole when the Crusaders said they were going out to defend Christendom. It was literally the majority of the population. So a lot of the guys were out there, and then they'd marry Arab women or Armenian women or Syrian women. And, they'd have families, and it's not that they were sort of military tourists necessarily. These were guys who were fighting for their family. And, these were guys maybe with French names, but with Arab heritage on many sides of their family, and fighting for villages, and they'd never seen France any more than the local Turkic or Arab people had either. I mean, this was ironically a surprisingly tolerant and very, very mixed community. Not at all what you'd imagine.
No, that's interesting. I mean, there are so many great stories in the book, so many great characters. I'd love to know, who is your favorite? Do you have one?
I do actually. It's a very, very weird story, and it's partly a nationalistic thing. There's a guy I'm really proud of, who's an Englishman called Godric, who's
I thought you might pick Godric, because he's the sort of pirate king. Well, you should tell the story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. He is a pirate king. But it's also a completely mental story, and he effectively saved the Crusades before they'd really started. If you think the Crusades, when they only got to Jerusalem in 1099. By 1102, there's a situation, but the Crusaders who arrived are hugely outnumbered. The king of Jerusalem goes into a battle by accident. This sounds very, made up, very contrived. But actually, he thought the king of Jerusalem attacked an invading Muslim force, thinking they were bandits. So he has 200 guys with him, which is quite a big force by his standards. And it turns out that it's the whole Egyptian field army, which could be up to 15 or 20,000 men. So he's clearly in a dreadful state. He manages to survive. Most of his friends and the government, because these guys, the knights, are the government as well. So most of the government dies in the fighting. And Baldwin escapes, wanders around for about 3 days. He's wounded. He's actually burnt because Egyptian light cavalry are trying to chase him out of some marshes and set fire to different bushes and so on. So eventually, after 3 days, he's in a huge state of shock, and he's on it's a wonderful story. It's true, actually, as well, by and large. He's on his faithful horse called Gazelle, and Gazelle was famous in Europe as well. Stories of Gazelle got back to France and Germany and England. So this king staggers into one of the only two surviving Crusader ports in Palestine. It's called Arsuf, which is a rubbish port. Been there a couple of times. It's an absolute nightmare. You wouldn't be there unless you're a very good mariner. And the rest of the Crusaders are sort of huddled in Jaffa, which is their other port, and people have packed their bags. Because as far as they're concerned, they haven't heard from the king. He's probably dead. The government's gone. All their knights are dead. So people are literally packing to go back to Europe. And at this moment, dear Baldwin and the lovely Gazelle stagger down to Arsuf, and people realize who they are. And he bumps into an English pirate called Godric, which Godric is an amazing, we haven't got time for it here, but he's an amazing character who's an ex kind of venture capitalist who's born around about the time of the Battle of Hastings. He was poor as well. So he was at the bottom end of society. He was an Anglo-Saxon. He was one of the oppressed, and he clawed his way out. He became a sailor. He became a merchant, or literally a venture capitalist. Eventually got to own his own boat in conjunction with some London traders. It's a very modern story. And we know that he was in the Crusader states. He was in Arsuf at the time. And he managed to get Baldwin out. They were blockaded by 33 Egyptian ships, a huge part of their navy, all professional. And he's in the world's most rubbish port that's actually difficult to get in or out of. And he did it. He managed to get Baldwin out with a huge amount of difficulty.
And his horse?
To evade them. Gazelle stayed in Arsuf, and he was still around. He does survive the story, but he's our hero. He's the third hero, I think. There's always three heroes in this story: Baldwin, Godric, and dear Gazelle. And Baldwin goes back, recovers, reforms the army, and routs the Egyptians. And saves the crusading movement. But really, the one who saved him was dear Godric, this Englishman. And Godric had an even more bizarre life after that, because he became a saint. He went back to England.
Not many pirates became. I'm guessing not many pirates became saints, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, they tend to focus on the ha-haing and all that. But dear Godric renounced all. He's a very pious guy, and in fact, that's the other thing we forget, is that you can be a ferociously violent, rapacious crusader or jihadist and still be genuinely pious. These are not necessarily, you don't see that as a contradiction. So, but dear Godric did see it as a contradiction, and he renounced worldly goods, and he repented from his actions, and he became a saint in the north of England. And even more, and he left an autobiography, or he dictated an autobiography. So we do have a lot of information on him. And the other extraordinary kind of pub quiz fact is I'm
interested because I'm interested in your sources. Yeah. Generally, you actually can still read his autobiography, can you?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. He couldn't write it himself. He dictated it. He was up in Finchale, up north, and it was a really nice one. We know what he looks like because of that. He says he had a comely nose and a long face with a slightly pointed chin, dark black hair that turned white as he got older. He's a man of real extremes. So he goes from being venture capitalist to pirate to saint. But the other weird thing is he was a music composer, and his surviving music work is the earliest composition in English. So he's the earliest, recorded English musician, as well as the only pirate saint. Yeah, what a guy.
I'd never heard of him, to be honest.
No, I hadn't either until I started researching this. Yeah, it's a crazy guy and crazy stories.
I remember when I was learning history, teaching Roman history, actually, back in my university days. And somebody said, we tend to judge people and their actions depending on how far away they are from us. So, and how we can imagine them now. People, if they're photographs of them or good paintings, they're real. If they're just kind of cartoon characters from some medieval manuscript, they're not really human, are they? They're just sort of funny, colourful figures, or maybe Roman statues. Actually, they look more lifelike. But there is a sense, though, is there not, from the medieval times, that we don't really, you try to humanize them a lot, but I think generally we do see them as slightly kind of comic, cartoon, almost Monty Python figures. Or is that just
No, you're absolutely right. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write this. I did want to put a bit more flesh on the bones. And actually, I think the character Monty Python is fabulous, and I do love. And obviously, they're clever, and a lot of what they say about the medieval world is true in a parody kind of way. But equally, I think they deserve a little bit more justice than that. So I'll try and do that. But equally, I think the underlying point is that you made is absolutely right, which is you can be flippant about a murder 1,000 years after the event. If you're reading about it in the paper, it's something very, very different. So yeah, I'm always conscious of that. There's one reason I didn't cover too much in terms of sexual violence, because that's the one area that doesn't get more kind of flippant over time. I think it's grim, it's superbly prevalent, it's just everywhere certainly in the Middle East and in the medieval Middle East, but it never becomes fun. You can never be flippant about it. So it does crop up in the book, but it's not something that I've majored on.
Good point. Well, my notes, which I'm still working through here. You write a lot about boxers, which I think is quite interesting. Both people not necessarily being in boxers, but also whole communities like Vikings. Most of us would probably assume that Vikings were pagans who were terrorizing Christians. I was amazed to discover Vikings were Crusaders as well. And there's a lot of kind of blending and bleeding across borders in your account of this time, which I thought was really refreshing, actually.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, bleeding is the operative word, though, I think, in many cases. Yeah, and like a good bit of print work, they do tend to bleed into each other. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right. These communities are very, very different. So for instance, Viking, you're absolutely right. I always used to think of them as pagans. But at some point they became Christian, and when they became Christian, they were just as pious as the next man. So you do get this situation where you get Viking fleets coming down. Effectively, they've launched their own crusade, and they behave just like they behave exactly like you'd expect. So they spend years getting there because they're having such a good time. It's a massive road trip. So they spend the whole winter and Christmas in London having a great knees up there, maybe gather a few Englishmen to come and help them. Then they sail all the way down the Atlantic coast, even raiding the odd Christian place if they didn't have enough food and they thought they weren't being treated well. But then they go into Islamic territories further down in Portugal and in the Balearics, and they're just, I think they fight this one crusade. I'm thinking of the King Sigurd of Norway. They fight 6 major battles just on the way down, just on the road trip, to the point where they start off with a big fleet, but by the time they get to the Middle East, it's enormous because they've attacked so many other fleets on the way and sacked so many other cities and just taken everything that wasn't nailed down. That A, they've got a massive fleet, and B, they're incredible veterans. So by the time they get to Egypt, the Egyptian fleet's too scared to come out and even see them, really. So they go and they help capture a city of Sidon. But the really interesting thing is that before they do any fighting in the Holy Land, they say to the King of Jerusalem, "Sorry, chum, we can't negotiate about anything at the moment because we need to go to the Holy Sepulchre and have mass." So everything is put on hold because these guys are genuinely pious, and they trudge off. They see the tomb of Jesus, where he was crucified as well. Then they stall all the negotiations because they want to go to the River Jordan. So they trudge off down towards the Jordan. So all the military stuff gets put on hold because these guys are, they're like my Irish grandma. They genuinely believe all that, and they're very pious and they love doing it. It's very important to them. And then they come back and destroy the city of Sidon and, do all the kind of crazy things that you'd expect Vikings to do. And that's true of pretty much all the communities. Everybody is not at all what you think. I mean, even in the 13th century, you get Vikings coming down. I just wish I was there. There's this very enduring image where John of Joinville writes about a Viking ship that had come down the coast of North Africa. And the guys stopped just so they could go lion hunting with their bows. So they were doing lion hunting by archery in North Africa as Vikings on the way to doing a crusade. I mean, you couldn't make it up, could you?
No, well, they're not like us. Of course, you work to humanize them and you do that, but they're not like us. Their world isn't like ours. It must have been extraordinary, given where they came from, to suddenly be in the Holy Land, to be able to visit where Jesus had walked. I mean, wow, it's head-blowing, mind-blowing stuff.
Yeah, actually, and a lot of the guys in that that fleet never went home at all. They went back via Byzantium. A lot of them joined the Varangian Guard. All the ships were sold to the Byzantine emperor, and the guys went on sort of barges back home up the other route. So
we've just about run out of time on my cheapskate subscription to Zoom, which I think is a good discipline anyway. But thank you so much. You've brought a world to life that kind of we've all thought about a little bit, but never really focused on. And it's never really touched, is it? There's no big TV dramas about the Crusades like there are about the Roman Empire. I mean, maybe there was a couple, but it's not really part of the common discourse in the media. And you've really brought it to life.
Yeah, no, thank you, Phil. I think the Crusades deserves to be brought to life a bit more because it's so different to what people really think at the moment.
Well, I'd thoroughly recommend the book. Immerse yourself in 250 years of pure carnage. But also a lot of fun. Okay, I've just created some new names for you: Clarence the Titan or Heinrich the Vicious. Either way.
Oh gosh, I don't think either is appropriate for me, really. I mean, sort of Tibble the Mild, probably. Tibble in a
all right.
way.
Well, I bid you well, Sir Tibble, and thanks so much for your time.
You too. Thanks. That was great fun.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Scandal Mongers podcast. This has been a Podcast World production. You can get in contact with our show by emailing team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandal Mongers in the heading, or via our social media links within the show's bio.